At the hospital, my dad said he's not my son, so I walked out. I'm 31M, my dad is 59M, and this all happened yesterday in about 12 hours that honestly feel like an entire lifetime squeezed into one long, ugly day. It started stupidly normal. I was sitting at my kitchen table around 7 a.m., half awake, eating a bowl of generic cornflakes that had gone soggy while scrolling through emails on my phone. The sky over my apartment in Columbus was that flat winter gray where it never really looks like morning or afternoon, just gray. I remember my coffee smelled burnt because I'd left it on the burner too long, and I was annoyed at myself about something that feels so trivial now. My phone buzzed face down on the table, and when I flipped it over, I saw my stepmom's name, Karen, lighting up the screen. She hardly ever calls me directly, especially that early, and I had that tiny drop in my stomach before I even answered, the kind you get when the roller coaster starts to move and you're locked in. The call was short and weirdly calm. Karen said my dad had been taken to Riverside Hospital overnight with chest pain, and they were keeping him for tests. She said he was stable, but her voice had that tightness in it, like she was trying to sound fine and barely pulling it off. She asked if I could come by sometime this morning if I wasn't too busy, and that phrasing stuck in my head more than it should have. Sometime this morning. Not please come now. Not your dad is asking for you. Just a light suggestion, like she was inviting me to brunch and not a hospital. I stood up automatically, bowl still on the table, milk ring on the wood, and told her I'd come over after I threw some things together. When I hung up, the apartment felt extra quiet, the fridge humming louder than usual, and I realized my hands were shaking just enough to slosh coffee when I picked up the mug. The drive to the hospital took about 20 minutes, but it felt longer with that gray sky pressing down and a light freezing drizzle hitting the windshield. Traffic was normal rush hour, people cutting each other off like nothing in the world was wrong, like nobody's dad was in a hospital gown hooked up to machines. I kept the heater on low because my old Civic smells faintly like antifreeze if I crank it too high, and I remember fiddling with the radio until I finally turned it off. I didn't want voices or music, just the sound of the wipers squeaking across the glass. In my head, I was running through all the times my dad had complained about his blood pressure but refused to stick to any diet. All the "I'm fine" comments when he'd get dizzy standing up too fast. I told myself this was probably just a scare and that he'd be annoyed I left work for no reason. But underneath that, there was this louder thought I was trying to ignore. What if this is it, and the last real conversation we had was that fight in August about money? When I pulled into the parking garage, my stomach clenched in that I might throw up way. The concrete levels all smelled like cold exhaust and wet tires. And for a second, I just sat there with the engine off, hearing it tick as it cooled. I checked my phone again. No new messages from Karen, nothing from my dad, obviously, and I grabbed my hoodie from the back seat because the wind knifes through you in those open-air garages. I walked toward the elevator, shoes echoing, and the closer I got to the hospital entrance, the more that sterile smell hit me. Disinfectant, coffee from the little kiosk, that underlying scent of sickness you only notice if you've spent enough time in hospitals. I stopped at the sliding doors, watched them open and close for 2 or 3 cycles like they were breathing, then stepped through into bright fluorescent light and 2 white walls. The check-in desk in the lobby had that glass barrier with a little slot at the bottom, and a bored-looking woman with a badge that said Nancy asked who I was there to see. Her nails were painted dark blue, chipped at the edges, and she was sipping from a large hospital-branded styrofoam cup that smelled strongly like cheap coffee. I told her my dad's full name, gave his date of birth, and watched her type with 2 fingers on a keyboard that had clearly seen some things. She glanced up at me once, taking in my hoodie, jeans, unshaven face, then said he'd been admitted to the cardiac unit on the 4th floor. She printed a sticker badge with my name and visitor in bold letters, the adhesive slightly peeling at the corner as she slapped it on the desk for me to pick up. I stuck it to my chest and felt weirdly like a kid again, needing permission to see my own father. The elevator ride felt longer than it actually was, that slow mechanical tug upward, the little digital numbers blinking from 1 to 4. A nurse with a cart full of linens was in there with me, humming some country song under her breath and scrolling on her phone. I stared at the floor tiles, noticing a small brown stain near my shoe that I kept telling myself was just coffee. When the doors opened on 4, I got hit with an even stronger mix of hand sanitizer, and whatever they cleaned floors with, sharp and artificial. The cardiac wing was quieter than the lobby, just the occasional beep from monitors and the soft murmur of nurses talking at the central station. I walked up to their desk, cleared my throat, and said I was looking for my dad. A younger nurse with curly hair pulled back tight looked him up, nodded, and pointed me toward room 412 down the hallway, second door on the left. My heart started thudding harder than it had the whole drive there. When I pushed open the door to 412, the first thing I saw was my dad's bare feet sticking out from the end of the bed, that familiar weirdly bent left pinky toe he's had since he broke it in high school. He was propped up slightly, hospital gown half open at the neck, a plastic wristband around his wrist, and wires disappearing under the thin blanket. The monitor next to him beeped steadily, green line jumping with each heartbeat. Karen was in the chair by the window, scrolling on her phone with that intense, focused look she always has, lips pressed tight. The room smelled like antiseptic and that generic lemon-scented cleaner, with a faint hint of the stale coffee in the foam cup on the rolling tray. When my dad turned his head and saw me, there was this split second where his face went completely blank, like he wasn't expecting me, and then he forced that familiar tight-lipped half-smile he uses on neighbors. We exchanged awkward hellos, and I pulled the extra chair from the corner to sit closer. I asked how he was feeling, and he gave a half-hearted joke about the hospital food while adjusting his blanket like it was personally offending him. Karen jumped in with the details the way she always does, saying something about enzymes and a possible minor heart attack during the night, how they were waiting for more tests, trying to sound like she'd already memorized the doctor's speech. I nodded like I understood, even though my brain was mostly stuck on the words minor heart attack, spinning in circles. My dad looked tired, older than the last time I'd seen him, gray stubble on his jaw, lines deeper on his forehead. At the same time, there was this edge in his eyes, sharp and defensive, the same look he gets when money comes up. It felt like there was a whole other conversation humming under the surface of the one we were actually having. We made small talk about my job, my apartment, the weather, all of it feeling like tissue paper stretched over something heavy. At one point, Karen got up to refill her coffee, the styrofoam cup creaking in her hand as she squeezed it a little too hard, and that left just me and my dad in this oddly quiet bubble. The TV mounted in the corner was playing some morning news show on mute, captions scrolling about a car accident on the highway, but neither of us looked at it. He shifted a little, wincing, then asked vaguely how things were going, which is his catch-all for, "Are you still mad about August?" I told him I was fine, that work was busy, that I'd paid off another chunk of my student loan. He blinked a little at that, eyes flicking away, and I remembered exactly how that last big fight started. Me asking if he'd ever help me the way he helped my half-sister with her down payment. Him saying I needed to stop acting entitled and be a man and handle my own stuff. Around mid-morning, maybe close to 10:30, a doctor in a white coat came in, flipping through a chart on a tablet. He introduced himself to my dad and Karen, gave the rundown on the test results, all in that practiced calm tone doctors use when they've done this 1,000 times. He explained that my dad had, in fact, had a mild heart attack, but that they'd caught it relatively early, that they wanted to do a more invasive procedure later that afternoon to check for blockages. While he was talking, he glanced at me a couple of times, probably trying to figure out who I was in the room. When he was done with the explanation, he asked who the primary contact was for medical decisions and insurance info. Karen immediately straightened up, smoothed her sweater, and said she was the spouse, that my dad's wallet and cards were with her. The doctor nodded but then looked at me again and asked, "And you are his son?" In this routine, matter-of-fact way. I said yes without thinking, because obviously, that's who I am. I'm his son, his oldest kid, the practice round he had with my mom before divorcing and starting a second family. The word came out of my mouth easily, a reflex more than anything. I didn't realize that this was the moment the whole day was going to pivot around. The doctor nodded, started to say something about next of kin and who should be updated, and that's when my dad shifted on the bed, cleared his throat, and interrupted. There was this tiny pause, like even his heart monitor skipped a beat, and then my dad said, in a tone that was almost casual, "He's not my son." It came out low but clear, not a slip, not a joke, just a flat statement. For a second, I thought I misheard him, because the words didn't make sense strung together like that, not in that room. not with that smell of antiseptic and the soft beep 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 behind him. The air in the room changed instantly. It felt heavier, thicker, like someone had turned down the oxygen. The doctor's pen stopped moving on his tablet. Karen froze halfway to taking a sip of her coffee, cup hovering near her mouth. I stared at my dad, waiting for some kind of clarification, a smirk, a follow-up like, "I'm just messing with you," but nothing came. He just stared straight ahead at the doctor, jaw tight, eyes a little glassy from the meds or the lack of sleep or whatever, and repeated, "He's not my son. She has my paperwork," nodding slightly toward Karen. My ears were ringing so loudly that for a second I couldn't even hear the monitor. It was like someone had taken the floor and shifted it 3 inches to the left, and I was the only one who felt it happen. I looked down at the visitor badge stuck crooked on my chest with my last name printed right there, the same one he's always had. The doctor tried to smooth it over in that professional way, clearing his throat and saying something like, "Okay, so for legal purposes, Mrs. Thompson will be the primary contact." But he glanced at me again with this awkward sympathy that made my skin crawl. I felt heat crawling up my neck, into my ears, that hot-cold mix you get when someone slaps you, but you're not allowed to react. Karen didn't say a word, just stared down at her knees, fingers gripping the styrofoam cup, so hard a little coffee sloshed over the rim onto her jeans. My dad avoided eye contact completely, eyes on the curtain rail or some invisible stain on the ceiling. I could feel every tiny sound in that room. The soft hiss of the oxygen tube, the faint wheeze of the HVAC, the squeak of the nurse's shoes in the hallway outside. Except my own breathing, which felt too loud, too obvious. That one sentence kept replaying on a loop in my head. He's not my son. The moment the doctor left the room, it felt like whatever thin layer of normalcy had been holding the morning together just snapped. He closed the door behind him gently, like he knew something personal had detonated inside and didn't want to make it worse. The beeping of the heart monitor kept going steady, which somehow made everything feel even more disconnected, because nothing about how I felt inside was steady. Karen stayed frozen in her chair, staring at a point on the wall like she'd zoned out, and my dad acted like the conversation hadn't even happened. He shifted awkwardly on the bed, adjusting the thin blanket, then reached for the remote to change the TV channel to a rerun of some old fishing show he likes. I watched his hand tremble slightly as he pressed the buttons, and for a weird second I wondered if he even realized what he'd said out loud, or if it slipped out from some place he'd kept buried and ugly for a long time. I cleared my throat once, trying to swallow this thick knot forming in it, but the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched on, cold and sharp, until I finally stood up because sitting felt impossible. I mumbled something like, "I'm going to step out for a minute," but my voice sounded rough and way too soft. My dad didn't look at me. Karen blinked a few times, coming back into her body like someone waking from a trance, and just nodded without lifting her eyes. I walked out of the room feeling like my legs didn't belong to me, like I was moving underwater or through thick fog. The hallway lights were too bright, and the disinfectant smell seemed stronger outside the room, nauseating even. I headed toward the family restroom near the elevators, pushed the door open, and locked myself inside. The mirror above the sink was slightly smudged, and when I looked at my reflection, I barely recognized myself. My face was pale, eyes too wide, jaw tight like I'd been clenching it for hours. I splashed cold water on my face, gripping the porcelain sink so hard the ridge cut into my palms. The water dripped down my hoodie, darkening the fabric, and I just let it sit there because I didn't have the energy to wipe it off. My ears were still ringing, and the words replayed so violently that for a second I thought I might pass out. I stayed in that bathroom for maybe 20 minutes, trying to breathe normally again, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. I kept thinking about stupid details, how my dad used to hold me on his shoulders at baseball games, how he taught me to change the oil in a car, how he grounded me for a month when I totaled my first one, how he wrote me a half-apology letter after he missed my college graduation. You don't do those things for someone who's not your son. Or maybe you do. I don't know. Maybe people are just complicated and messy in ways I don't understand. I pulled my hoodie sleeves up over my hands, feeling that old instinct I had as a kid when I'd get anxious. Eventually, when the pounding in my head eased enough that I could think straight, I unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway. A nurse walked by carrying a stack of blankets, giving me a polite smile that felt painfully normal compared to what was happening inside me. I didn't go back to the room right away. I found a vending machine area with 2 plastic chairs and a view of the parking garage through a fogged window. I sat there for a few minutes, elbows on my knees, trying to figure out whether I should confront my dad, leave the hospital entirely, or just pretend none of it happened. Every option felt wrong in its own way. I checked my phone. Still nothing from Karen, nothing from anyone, and stared at the time for too long. 11:07 a.m. It felt like the day had already stretched into 3 separate lifetimes. A man in scrubs sat in the other chair briefly, opened a bag of chips, then left without saying a word, and that tiny slice of normalcy actually grounded me a bit. Eventually, I pushed myself up and forced my legs to carry me back toward the cardiac wing. The hallway felt colder than before, and when I got to the door of room 412, I hesitated, staring at the wood grain and the little metal plate with the room number before finally pushing it open. Inside, the atmosphere felt different, tense in a quieter, more compressed way. Karen was standing near the window with her arms crossed tight, looking out at nothing, and my dad was pretending to nap, though his breathing was too uneven for real sleep. The TV was still on the fishing show, muted again, captions rolling endlessly at the bottom. When Karen looked up and saw me, her expression shifted into something I couldn't read. Guilt, maybe, or frustration, or fear. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, then closed it again. My dad didn't react at all. I sat back in my chair, feeling the vinyl cushion sticking slightly to my hoodie, and tried to act calm. Karen eventually cleared her throat and said she was going downstairs to grab something from the cafeteria. She left quickly, almost like she was fleeing the room, leaving me alone with the man who'd just denied me in front of a stranger like it was nothing. I waited until the door clicked shut behind her before I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell or curse or demand anything. I just asked quiet, direct questions. What was that earlier? Why would you say that? My dad didn't answer at first. He kept staring at the TV, blinking slowly, jaw tight. After a minute, he sighed in that exaggerated way he does when he's annoyed, not when he's cornered or guilty. He said he didn't want confusion with the doctor, and that things are complicated enough. He said Karen handles all his medical stuff, so there was no point bringing more people into it. More people. That's how he said it. Like I wasn't one of the actual people who should matter in moments like this. My pulse started pounding again, and I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck, but I forced myself to breathe slowly because I didn't want to lose control in that room. I told him it wasn't about paperwork, it was about what he said. He shrugged a little, wincing from the movement, and muttered something like, "You know what I meant, except I didn't." Not really. Not after everything. The silence between us felt like static, buzzing, prickling at the edges. I kept waiting for him to correct himself, to take back the words, to clarify that he was talking about legal guardianship or some other bureaucratic nonsense, but he didn't. He avoided eye contact the whole time, fiddling with the blanket, adjusting the pillow, acting like a man bothered by a minor inconvenience instead of the emotional landmine he'd just triggered. I watched him breathe, chest rising and falling under the thin hospital gown, and wondered if this had been sitting inside him for years, waiting for the right, or wrong, moment to come out. The entire room felt colder, like someone had opened a window I couldn't see. I shifted in my chair, and the plastic visitor badge crinkled against my chest, reminding me, in a stupid symbolic way, that I was officially labeled as someone who didn't belong in that moment. Karen came back with a small paper bag and a coffee cup, the cafeteria smell entering the room with her, burnt fries, powdered eggs, something vaguely sweet like cinnamon rolls. She sat back down without saying anything, but her eyes flicked between me and my dad in this sharp, anxious way. She must have felt the tension because she kept fiddling with the paper bag, smoothing its edges, rolling it closed, and then unrolling it again. My dad pretended to be absorbed in the TV, though the show had changed to something completely different. I kept replaying the morning in my head over and over with no clarity attached to it. Karen eventually broke the silence by saying the doctor would be back around early afternoon to discuss the procedure. Her voice trembled just slightly at the end, the only real crack I'd seen from her all day. Neither my dad nor I responded. The air felt too tight to speak through. Around noon, a nurse came in to check my dad's vitals, and the whole room shifted into that polite, fake calm people put on in front of strangers. Karen straightened her posture, my dad softened his expression, and I sat quietly with my hands clasped together. The nurse adjusted the leads on his chest, checked the 4-line, asked a few routine questions, then wrote something on a chart. When she left, the doors swinging shut behind her, the tension snapped right back into place like a rubber band pulled too tight. My dad closed his eyes like he was exhausted, and for the first time that day, I actually believed he was. His breathing was uneven, labored in a subtle way that made something inside me twinge with guilt, no matter how angry I was. I shifted in my seat, the legs of the chair scraping softly against the linoleum, and wondered if staying there was doing either of us any good. A little before 1 p.m., the doctor returned with more details about the afternoon procedure. He asked if there were any questions, and Karen stepped into her usual role as spokesperson, asking about recovery time and risks. My dad nodded weakly through her questions, and I stood there feeling like a ghost in the room, someone whose presence was tolerated but not acknowledged. The doctor glanced at me again at one point, probably unsure how to navigate whatever unspoken tension he'd walked into earlier. When he finished explaining everything, he asked if we needed a moment alone. Nobody answered him. After a few seconds, he nodded awkwardly and left. As soon as the door closed, my dad let out a long, shaky breath and muttered something under his breath that I couldn't catch. Karen rubbed her forehead like she was fighting off a headache. I stared at a small crack in the paint near the light switch, fixating on it because it was easier than looking at either of them. By early afternoon, I started feeling that restless, trapped sensation you get when you've been in one place too long under too much pressure. The hospital air felt too thin, too recycled, too artificial. I told Karen I was going to grab something from the cafeteria, even though I wasn't hungry. She nodded without looking up, and my dad didn't react at all. I stepped into the hallway, hearing the soft buzz of fluorescent lights and a distant overhead announcement calling for a nurse in another unit. As I walked toward the elevators, I felt this sudden, overwhelming need to call someone, anyone, to tell them what had happened, just to say it out loud and hear another human voice respond. But my contact list felt empty in a way that surprised me. I had friends, sure, but nobody I felt close enough to dump this kind of emotional disaster on in the middle of a workday. I shoved my phone back in my pocket and kept walking, feeling my chest tighten in that painful, frustrated way you can't stretch out. When I reached the cafeteria, the place was buzzing with the usual lunch hour noise, trays clattering, conversations mixing into a dull hum, the soda machine sputtering ice into plastic cups. The smell of overcooked vegetables and industrial fryer oil lingered in the air, thick enough that I hesitated to breathe through my nose. I walked past the hot food line without stopping and ended up at the far corner near a window that overlooked the side lot where ambulances pulled in. Snow had started drifting lightly across the pavement, collecting around the orange cones and the faded yellow parking lines. I grabbed a bottled water and an energy bar from the refrigerated section, mostly for something to hold, then paid at the register where the cashier barely glanced up at me. I sat down at an empty table near a humming soda fountain, the cheap plastic chair wobbling just slightly every time I shifted my weight. I unwrapped the energy bar, took one small bite, and immediately realized I couldn't swallow it. My throat felt too tight. The unwrapped bar sat on the table like a prop, useless but somehow grounding in its own way. I must have sat there for half an hour, maybe more, just replaying the morning over and over. My dad's words had carved themselves into my head so sharply I felt like I could still hear the exact cadence of them. He's not my son. 5 words. 5 stupid words that shouldn't have the ability to split a life cleanly down the middle, but somehow they had. I kept remembering the doctor's pause, Karen's hand tightening around her coffee cup, the way my dad didn't even look at me when he said it. No flinch. No hesitation. Just a blunt correction, like someone pointing out a wrong address on a form. I attempted to distract myself by scrolling aimlessly through text messages, emails, even social media, but nothing stuck. Every buzz, every notification felt like it was happening in a world where my dad hadn't said that. The contrast made me nauseous. After a while, I tossed the half-eaten energy bar into the trash and stood up, realizing my legs were stiff and my lower back ached from sitting in that awful chair. I threw the empty bottle away too and decided to force myself back upstairs, even though my entire body resisted the idea. The walk back to the cardiac floor felt heavier than earlier, like the entire building had settled on my shoulders. I passed a family gathered around a cluster of chairs, someone crying softly into a jacket sleeve, someone else rubbing their back in slow circles. Hospitals compress everyone's lives into the same gray emotional space, just different intensities. By the time I reached the fourth floor, my chest felt tight again, and my hands were cold enough that I rubbed them together a few times before pushing the door open to the hallway. As I approached room 412, I heard muted voices inside, Karen's sharper, controlled tone and my dad's lower, tired murmur. I slowed down without meaning to. Something in me resisted interrupting whatever was happening. I paused just outside the doorway, not pressed against it or anything, but close enough to catch the general tone of the conversation. Not the words, just the cadence. And that was somehow worse. Karen sounded tense in a way I'd never heard before. My dad sounded defensive, anxious. I couldn't tell. Then everything went silent, abruptly. Too abruptly. I stepped back slightly, pretending I'd just arrived, then walked in a couple seconds later. When I entered, they both startled just slightly. Karen straightened her posture too fast, and my dad blinked like he'd been interrupted mid-sentence. Neither of them said what they'd been talking about, but the guilt sat on the air like smoke. Karen gave me a forced smile, asked if I got something to eat. I said yeah, even though it wasn't true. She nodded and sat back down, folding her hands in her lap in a way that screamed tension. My dad didn't look at me directly but gave a faint nod, as if acknowledging I'd returned. The TV had switched to daytime courtroom programming, but the volume was still muted. The judge's face moved silently on the screen, pointing at someone off camera, and it made the entire room feel surreal. I sat down in my chair and felt the stiff plastic dig into the back of my shoulders. The silence stretched again, thin and strained, punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. I watched my dad's hands resting on the blanket, hands I'd always recognized instantly. Same shape as mine, same knuckles, same crooked bend in the ring finger. It hit me again. How do you deny someone who looks so much like you? The next couple of hours blurred together in a gray, slushy haze. Nurses came in and out, adjusting machines, checking vitals, asking standard questions. Karen answered most of them while I sat quietly, trying to keep my breathing steady. At one point, the nurse asked if my dad wanted anything from the comfort cart. Iced chips, warm blankets, ginger ale. He shook his head, but looked exhausted just from that small conversation. Karen stepped out to take a phone call around 2:15, leaving the door slightly ajar. I could hear her voice in the hallway, hushed and tense, but I couldn't make out anything specific. My dad kept his eyes closed, breathing shallowly, but I could tell he wasn't asleep. I considered asking him again, pressing the issue, demanding clarity, anything, but something in the way his jaw tightened made me hold back. Instead, I stared at the edge of the blanket tucked around his waist and felt a cold numbness settle in my chest, like frost spreading slow and deliberate. The question that kept circling in my head wasn't even, why did he say that? It was, how long has he believed it? A little after 3 p.m., a different doctor, maybe a specialist, came in to explain the details of the angiogram they planned to do. He talked about catheter insertion, dye injection, potential stent placement, recovery expectations. Karen slid back into the room midway through, her cheeks flushed from whatever call she'd been on. She nodded along, asked a couple of follow-up questions, while my dad stared at the wall, barely responding. When the doctor left, she reached out and squeezed my dad's shoulder, whispering something too quiet for me to catch. He closed his eyes again, exhaling slowly. I watched the two of them interact, the automatic way she leaned toward him, the practiced calm in her voice. And it struck me that I had no role in this dynamic. Not anymore. Maybe not for years. Something inside me sagged at the realization, like a floorboard giving way under my feet. I leaned back in my chair and felt my visitor badge tug slightly at my hoodie, reminding me again how temporary my presence felt there. Around 3:45, a nurse came to prep my dad for the procedure. She asked Karen to accompany him down to the prep area, explaining that only one person could go with the patient. Karen glanced unsurely between us, but my dad answered before she could. Karen goes. No hesitation. No second thought. He didn't even look in my direction. That was the moment the emotional tilt of the day shifted completely. Something in me went cold and steady. Not numb, Exactly, but clarified. Like a camera focusing. Karen gave me a small apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes, then grabbed her bag and stood beside the bed while the nurse unlocked the wheels and prepared to roll him out. My dad kept his eyes forward the entire time. As they moved him toward the hallway, the blanket shifting slightly across his chest, I stood up automatically, stepping back to give them space. Karen murmured a quiet thank you to the nurse, adjusted the blanket once more, and followed them out. The door swung shut behind them, leaving the room abruptly, almost violently, quiet. The silence after they left didn't just fill the room. It pressed in on me from all sides. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do with my hands, or my breathing, or my entire existence. The room looked different without my dad in it. The bed was empty, the blanket still warm-looking, one pillow indented where his head had been. The monitor showed a flat line now, not because he'd crashed, but because he wasn't connected anymore. The harsh fluorescent light made every scuff mark and dent in the walls more visible. I took a slow breath, then sat back down in my chair, staring at the spot where he'd just been. My heart was pounding, but not from panic, more from a slow, spreading realization that whatever relationship my dad and I used to have had fractured in a way that couldn't be undone. Not over money, not over favoritism, not over neglect. Over 5 words spoken casually to a stranger. Words he didn't take back. Words he didn't even try to soften afterward. The weight of it settled on me like wet concrete. I stayed in that room alone for maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20. It was hard to track time anymore. Eventually, I stood up and walked around the small space, my fingers grazing over the rolling tray, the chair Karen had used, the edge of the windowsill where condensation had begun to collect. I looked out at the parking garage through the smudged glass and noticed my car still sitting in the same spot hours later, frost forming on the windshield. My reflection stared back at me faintly, blending into the gray sky outside. I looked tired, older somehow. As I turned back toward the bed, something on the floor caught my eye. A folded piece of paper, half stuck under the chair where Karen had been sitting. I hesitated, then bent down to pick it up. It was a hospital billing printout, probably dropped from her bag earlier. Nothing dramatic, nothing revealing. But the patient name printed at the top hit me like a punch to the gut. Not because it was wrong, but because it was right. My dad's name was there, bold and black. The emergency contact listed beneath, it was Karen. And the section labeled secondary/other family contact was blank. Completely blank. As if I didn't exist at all. I stared at that blank space for longer than I want to admit. It wasn't meant to be a personal document. It wasn't some big secret. It was just a form. But forms reflect reality. The reality people choose, the reality they allow to be recorded. Seeing that empty line, intentionally left empty, made everything click together with a kind of quiet violence. My dad hadn't misspoken earlier. He hadn't been confused. He hadn't been referring to paperwork. He had meant exactly what he said. And whatever complicated mess existed behind those words wasn't mine to unravel anymore. I folded the paper back the way I found it and slipped it onto the rolling tray, leaving it where Karen would see it, but know I hadn't taken anything. Then I sat back down and waited, not for news about the procedure, not for Karen to return, not for some sudden apology that would fix what had cracked wide open. I waited to feel something other than the sharp, steady hurt that had taken root in my chest. When Karen eventually returned to the room, she looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with walking or waiting and everything to do with guilt she didn't know where to place. Her cheeks were blotchy, her hair frizzed from the humidity of the lower floors, and she held her phone in both hands like she was scared it might slip through her fingers. She told me the procedure would take about an hour, maybe a little more, and that the doctor said everything looked stable so far. Her voice kept wavering around the edges, smoothing out only when she talked about medical facts, the same way she always does when reality gets too sharp and she needs something structured to hold on to. I nodded, listening but not really absorbing the details, because something inside me had already shifted earlier in a way that felt final. Karen sat down in her chair, letting out a long breath as she rested her elbows on her knees. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something more personal, something honest, but the words never formed. Instead, she just stared at the blank hospital TV screen, waiting for it to flicker back on after its automatic power cycle. I sat across from her, and neither of us said anything for a long few minutes. At some point, The silence became heavy enough that she stood up again and started pacing a bit, rubbing her hands together as though trying to warm them. The vents blew cold, recycled air into the room, making the smell of disinfectant stronger. Karen stopped near the foot of the bed and finally said, very softly, that she didn't know things were this bad between me and my dad. I told her I didn't know either. Not like this. Not to the point where he could dismiss me in a sentence without even looking my way. She looked down at the blanket, smoothing one of its corners with her thumb, and told me she'd always assumed he didn't talk about our problems because it hurt him, not because he wanted to erase me. She said it carefully, like she was trying not to break something fragile. I didn't respond. I wasn't angry with her. Not really. I think part of me had always known she was caught in the gravitational pull of his version of family, his way of deciding who mattered and who didn't. But hearing her say it made the whole day feel even colder, like I'd been orbiting outside that gravitational pull for years without fully admitting it. The waiting dragged on, every minute stretching into 5. Karen checked her phone repeatedly, not for updates from the surgical team, but just to have something to look at that wasn't me, or the empty hospital bed, or the wall clock ticking too loudly. I stared at the chair my dad had used earlier, the slight indentation in the thin hospital pillow still pressed into its shape. It was strange how physical objects hold the shape of people even after they leave. I tried to picture him waking up from anesthesia, groggy and irritable, probably demanding Karen tell the staff not to fuss over him. I tried to imagine him asking if I was still there. I wasn't sure if the answer terrified me more if it was yes or if it was no. I stretched my legs out, feeling the stiffness settling in my knees and lower back, and leaned forward with my elbows on my thighs. A headache had started pulsing behind my eyes, slow and rhythmic, like the hospital machines were syncing with my heartbeat. The room felt both too small and too empty at the same time. Around an hour later, a nurse appeared at the door, knocking gently before stepping inside. She said the procedure had gone well, no complications, and they were moving my dad to recovery. She added that only one person could see him until he was fully awake. Karen immediately nodded and grabbed her bag, her body moving before her mouth even formed the words. She said she'd go down and stay with him and let me know when he was transferred back upstairs. Her tone wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was procedural, like she had accepted that my place here was optional, voluntary, disposable. I told her I understood, and I meant it. She walked quickly toward the elevator with the nurse, and I watched her go, her footsteps fading down the hallway. When the door shut behind them, the room settled into that strange static quiet again. I felt something loosen in my chest then, not relief, not resignation, but clarity, the kind that arrives quietly and without permission. I sat alone in that room for several more minutes, staring at the empty space where the bed had been. The light from the window had shifted into that muted late-afternoon glow, casting a pale stripe across the floor tiles. Snow was falling harder now, drifting past the glass in slow, uneven patterns. I stood up and walked to the window, pressing my palm lightly against the cool surface. My reflection stared back at me, half translucent over the parking lot. I looked tired, worn, but strangely calm for the first time all day. I thought about leaving then, just grabbing my jacket, tossing the visitor badge into the trash, and walking out of the hospital without waiting for any updates. The idea didn't feel dramatic or angry. It felt correct, like stepping out of a room that wasn't mine anymore. I moved back toward the chair, grabbed my phone, and checked for messages. Nothing. Not surprising. My dad wasn't the type to wake up from sedation and ask for me. And if he did, Karen would handle it before it reached me anyway. Eventually, I reached a point where staying felt pointless, like sitting in that stale white room was performing some version of loyalty that only I cared about. I picked up my hoodie from the back of the chair, shook out the wrinkles, and put it on. The visitor badge crinkled slightly as it shifted against the fabric. I pulled it off carefully and stared at it for a moment. My name printed in bold, my identity reduced to a temporary sticker that the hospital would throw away at the end of the day. It weirdly felt symbolic. I folded it once, then dropped it into the small trash bin beside the rolling tray. I grabbed my keys, slipped them into my pocket, and walked to the door. Before leaving, I glanced back one last time at the empty room, the neatly folded blanket on the chair, the faint indentation on the pillow. Then I turned off the overhead light out of habit, even though I knew someone else would come in and turn it back on later. The hallway outside felt colder, quieter than before. My footsteps echoed softly as I walked toward the elevators, passing nurses pushing carts and a doctor tapping rapidly on a tablet. Everyone moved with purpose, with roles, with certainty about their place in the building. I felt none of that, but I didn't feel lost anymore either. When the elevator arrived, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed smoothly, sealing in the fluorescent light. The descent felt faster than the ascent earlier in the morning, like the building itself wanted me gone. When the doors opened, the smell of the lobby, coffee, hand sanitizer, winter coats, hit me all at once. I walked past the check-in desk, past the kiosk where someone was arguing about the price of a sandwich, past the automatic doors that opened with a whoosh of cold air. The gray sky outside was darker now, snow falling steadily, the wind sharp against my face. I tucked my chin into my hoodie and headed toward the parking garage. The walk to my car felt strangely light, like each step was clearing something out of my chest I didn't realize had been suffocating me for years. The frost on my windshield glittered under the dim garage lights. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there without turning on the engine. The silence inside the car was warm and heavy, but not painful. Not this time. I thought about everything that had happened, everything that hadn't, the words he said, the silence that followed, the blank space on the hospital form. And then, finally, I thought about what I wanted. Not from him, not from Karen, but for myself. And for the first time in a long time, the answer wasn't shaped by guilt or obligation. It was shaped by freedom, by release, by the realization that I didn't owe my emotional availability to someone who refused to acknowledge it. I started the engine, the heater blowing warm air across my freezing hands, and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, but certainty. Leaving wasn't a punishment for him. It was a choice for me. A choice to stop standing in doorways waiting to be let in. A choice to stop auditioning for a role in a family that had already been cast without me. I drove out of the garage slowly, snow swirling under the headlights, and headed toward home. The roads were slick, traffic light, the city wrapped in that quiet winter hush that makes everything feel softer. As I drove, my phone buzzed once with a text from Karen. He's awake. Procedure went well. He's asking how things went up here. I read it at a stoplight, stared at the words for a long moment, then put the phone face down on the passenger seat without replying. Whatever he wanted to know, whatever story he wanted to hear, he'd have to live with the silence he created. By the time I reached my apartment, the snow had thickened into a steady curtain, muffling the sounds of the street. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, looking at the faint glow of my living room window. My place wasn't big, wasn't impressive, but it was mine. My life, my job, my routines, my decisions were mine, not shaped around waiting for acknowledgement that would never come. I walked inside, kicked off my shoes, and felt this deep, quiet sense of relief settle into my bones. Not triumph, not revenge, not victory, just release. A clean cut where a wound used to be. And that was enough. I didn't gain money, or an inheritance, or an apology, but I gained something I didn't know I'd been missing. The freedom to stop chasing someone who had no intention of meeting me halfway. That was the win. Not loud, not dramatic, but real.